The bread hit the floor before anyone said a word. Chef Dominic Leclair had pulled it straight from Noelle Vanbrocklin's hands. Both loaves, the ones she'd been cooling on the rack since 5 that morning, and dropped them into the waste bin with the kind of deliberate slowness that was worse than throwing. He didn't even look at her when he did it. He looked at the rest of the kitchen. The prep cooks, the line staff, the dishwashers. He made sure they were all watching. "This," he said, loud enough to fill the entire kitchen, "is what happens when someone who scrubs pans decides they're a baker." Noelle didn't move. She was 23 years old, standing in the walk-in staging area of Le Grenier, one of Vancouver's most decorated restaurants, 3 consecutive years on Canada's 100 best list, wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit because she'd borrowed it from the linen stock and sewn the hem herself. She was the dish attendant. She had been for 14 months. The loaves in that bin were sourdough. Dark rye, actually, with a crust that had taken her 6 tries to get right. She'd been experimenting on her days off, coming in early to use the proofing drawer before the bakers arrived. She hadn't asked permission. That part was on her. But she'd left a note on the rack explaining what they were and asking if anyone wanted to try them. Dominic had read the note, then he'd thrown the bread away. "Next time you use my equipment for your hobby projects," he said, pulling off his gloves and dropping them on the counter, "you'll be finding a new hobby somewhere else." He walked back to his office. The kitchen went quiet in the way kitchens go quiet when everyone is pretending to be very busy. Noelle picked up her bin of soaking pans. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't cry until she got to the parking lot, and even then she made herself stop after 4 minutes, because she had a bus to catch. She had come to Vancouver from Sudbury 2 years earlier, in science, with $260, a reference letter from a church kitchen, and a notebook so full of her grandmother's recipes that the binding had cracked down the middle. Her grandmother, Odette, had never worked in a restaurant a day in her life. She'd been a seamstress in Timmins for 40 years and had raised 4 children in a house that smelled permanently of bread and wood smoke. The bread was not coincidental. Odette baked every Saturday, the same way her own mother had, and she'd kept a notebook of everything she made. Not just recipes, but notes, margin notes. Add the water warmer in winter. This dough knows when you're rushing it. Don't rush it. When Odette died, she left the notebook to Noelle, not to her daughters. To her granddaughter, who at 12 had been the only one who ever sat with her in the kitchen and actually paid attention. Noelle had paid attention to everything. The starter she'd been maintaining since she was 15 was now 8 years old. She'd carried it across the province in a jar wrapped in a wool sock. In Sudbury, she hadn't had the vocabulary for what she loved. She just knew that when she was baking, she was calm in a way she wasn't anywhere else. She'd applied to culinary school twice and been rejected both times. The second time, because the timing conflicted with her mother's illness, and she'd missed the enrollment deadline by 1 day. She hadn't applied again. Instead, she'd saved for 2 years and moved west, and she'd taken the first kitchen job she could find, which was washing dishes at a hotel restaurant in Burnaby. From there, she'd worked her way to Le Grenier, not as a cook, as a dish attendant, because the posting had listed kitchen experience preferred, and she had that. She'd told herself it was a foot in the door. 14 months later, the door had not opened, but she had learned every station in that kitchen just by watching, and on her days off she baked, and one morning she'd left 2 loaves on the rack with a note. She didn't quit after the bread incident. She thought about it, spent most of the bus home thinking about it, and then lay awake that night running the same loop of thoughts that always comes, at 2 in the morning, the kind where you catalog every reason your instincts are wrong, and every sign you've been fooling yourself. She thought about the 8-year-old starter in her fridge, and whether that was charming or pathetic. She landed somewhere in the middle, and then fell asleep because she had to be up at 4:30. She kept showing up. She kept her bread experiments to her apartment. What she didn't stop doing was noticing. She noticed the prep schedule and where time was being lost. She noticed which mise en place got redone twice because it had been done wrong the first time. She noticed the bread service. Le Grenier did a house loaf with their dinner menu, baked in-house, and it was fine. Technically fine, but it had been the same loaf for 3 years. She had opinions about it that she kept entirely to herself. There was one person in that kitchen who ever spoke to her like a person rather than a piece of equipment. His name was Cyrus Beaulieu, a saucier who had worked with Dominic for 7 years. and who had, in Noelle's estimation, more actual talent than anyone in the building, including Dominic. Cyrus was the kind of cook who tasted everything 3 times and adjusted without being told to, who could tell when a stock needed another 20 minutes just from the way the surface moved. He was also, she'd noticed, the person Dominic interrupted most often, corrected most publicly, and credited least. Cyrus had watched the bread incident from across the kitchen. That evening, as Noelle was finishing her close, he'd come by and said, without stopping walking, "The crust on the dark one looked good from where I was standing." She hadn't known what to do with that for a week. The thing about Dominic Leclair was that he was not simply an unkind man. That would have been more straightforward. He was, in fact, genuinely skilled, had trained in Lyon, had worked under people whose names meant something in this industry, had built Le Grenier into what it was through a combination of real craft and unrelenting control. He was the kind of chef who believed that a kitchen was a hierarchy for good reason, and that the hierarchy was not cruel, it was efficient, and that sentiment was the enemy of quality. He also believed, with the certainty of a man who has never had to question it, that talent announced itself, that if you had it, people could see it, that if no one was looking, you probably didn't. This belief had served him well in Lyon, where the kitchens were full of people whose families had been in food for generations, and who had grown up with the vocabulary to perform their skill in ways he recognized. It served him less well in reading people who had not grown up with that vocabulary. People who had learned in church kitchens and grandmothers' houses and 14 months of watching from behind a spray hose. He had looked at Noelle and seen a dish attendant. The evidence available to him confirmed this. He had not looked harder. What he had done in the 3 weeks following the bread incident was stop at the rack one morning and notice that the house loaf smelled different. Better. He'd stood there for a moment, then gone into his office without saying anything. He didn't know that Noelle had been arriving 20 minutes earlier than her shift for the past 2 weeks. Long enough to have a brief conversation with the overnight baker, a tired Portuguese man named Ferreira, who had been baking the same recipe for 3 years and had absolutely no objection. When she started leaving him small handwritten notes with suggestions, which he implemented without fanfare because they worked, and he was tired, and she was not asking for credit. Dominic didn't know any of this. What he knew was that the bread was better. He brought it up in service meeting without identifying the change. Everyone agreed it was better. The conversation moved on. Noelle found out she was being dismissed on a Thursday afternoon in March, not for cause. Le Grenier was reducing its support staff, 2 dish attendants, 1 porter. She was given 2 weeks' notice and a handshake from the floor manager, a decent man who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the conversation. She walked to the parking lot. She sat in the cold for 15 minutes. Then she texted Cyrus because she didn't know who else to tell. He called her back in 4 minutes. "I know," he said. "I heard this morning. I'm sorry. Are you still going to the new space?" There was a pause. Cyrus had been telling her for months, quietly, in the way you tell things to someone you trust more than you realize about a project. A small restaurant, 10 tables, in a neighborhood east of Main Street. A friend of a friend had a space. Cyrus had money saved. He had a concept. Honest food, French-Canadian technique, real ingredients. Nothing that needed a tweezers to plate. He'd been circling it for a year. "I think so," he said. "I was going to talk to you about something." "About what?" "About whether you want to do the bread program." She almost said, "What bread program?" She stopped herself. "Tell me more," she said. The restaurant was called Ants, after a word Cyrus's grandmother used to use for the small coves along the St. Lawrence. It opened in November of the following year, 14 months after Noelle was let go from Le Grenier, in a space that had previously been a Vietnamese grocery, and before that an appliance repair shop. They had 11 seats at first, eventually 12 when they squeezed in a small 2-top near the window. The kitchen was the size of a large closet. The bread oven Noelle had found secondhand in Abbotsford and driven back herself in a borrowed van. She had spent those 14 months the way her grandmother had spent 40 years, precisely, without hurry, with attention. She had developed 9 loaves, not 9 recipes, 9 finished loaves, tested enough times that she could make them in her sleep, adjusted for Vancouver's climate, for the flour she'd sourced from a grain mill in Saskatchewan, for the particular behavior of her starter in winter versus summer. She had notebooks now, her own. The margin notes were in her handwriting, and they sounded a little like Odette's. This one knows when you're distracted. Be present. Ants did not open with fanfare. Cyrus wasn't the kind of person who was interested in fanfare. What he cared about was whether the food was right, and for the first 6 months he and Noelle worked inside a calm and somewhat private certainty that it was. The tables filled slowly, then consistently, then there was a wait list on Friday and Saturday. The bread was being talked about, not in marketing, in conversations. Someone would have dinner and then text a friend and say, "You have to try the bread at this place." A food writer for a magazine based in Toronto came out in February and wrote a piece that was mostly about Cyrus but included 2 paragraphs about the bread program that were more precise than most full articles Noelle had ever read on the subject. The writer understood fermentation. She understood heritage grain. She described the dark rye as having the kind of depth that makes you think about who taught the baker and what they were taught and how long ago. Noelle read that line 3 times. Dominic Leclair came to Ants on a Wednesday night in April, 18 months after Noelle had been let go. He made the reservation under a different name. Not unusual for someone in the industry checking out a competitor. But Cyrus recognized him before the first course arrived and mentioned it to Noelle quietly in the kitchen. She kept working. She didn't go out to the dining room. She had bread to pull from the oven and a prep list for the following morning. She heard later from Cyrus that Dominic had eaten the full menu and asked the server twice about the bread, where it was made, whether it was brought in. The server had explained that all bread was made in-house. He'd asked if he could speak to the baker. Cyrus had passed that request along to Noelle. She'd taken a minute. Then she'd untied her apron, washed her hands, and gone out. He was at the corner table near the window, the one that caught the light even in the evening. He looked older than she remembered, which surprised her. It had been 18 months, not 18 years. He had a glass of wine he'd barely touched, and the expression of a man who was trying to look like he had expected this. "You made this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, all of them, all of them." He looked at the table. "I didn't know you baked." She thought about saying, "I left 2 loaves on the rack and a note." She thought about the waste bin. She thought about him making sure everyone in the kitchen was watching. "You knew," she said. "You chose not to." He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't need him to. "The dark rye," he said finally. "At the restaurant before you left. That was you, wasn't it?" Ferreira started. "I left him notes. He was kind enough to use them." Another silence outside. Someone walked by with a dog. The room was full and warm, and it smelled like everything she had spent the last 18 months building. "The bread here is exceptional," he said, not as a compliment exactly, as a concession. The kind of sentence a certain kind of person can barely get out, because saying it means admitting something they can't quite name. "Thank you," she said. She went back to the kitchen. The James Beard nomination came in May, not for Noelle specifically. The category was Outstanding Restaurant, and Ants was one of 5 Canadian restaurants named, the only one from west of Ontario. It was the first time in 11 years a Vancouver restaurant had been on the list in that category. The morning the nomination was announced, Cyrus texted her a string of incomprehensible characters, and then called and said nothing for about 10 seconds, and then said, "We did it," in a voice. She'd never heard from him before. She was in the kitchen. She had dough on the counter. The starter, 8 years old now, 10 if she counted from the original culture, Odette had given her on a quiet Saturday afternoon in a house in Timmins, was sitting in its jar on the shelf, doing what it had always done. Her grandmother had never tasted this bread. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the days that followed, when people asked her what it meant, and she was supposed to have an answer. Odette had never tasted it, but something of Odette was in it, in the warmth of the water, and the weight of the patience and the margin notes that told, "You don't rush it," and in some way that Noelle couldn't fully articulate to interviewers or journalists, or anyone who hadn't sat in that kitchen in Timmins at 12 years old, watching an old woman's hands move through flour. In some way, Odette was present every morning at 4:30. That's the thing no one tells you about real skill. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from someone who loved you enough to show you, quietly, without agenda, in a kitchen that wasn't impressive by anyone's standards, at an age when you didn't yet know you were being changed. The bread at Ants won the award 9 months later. The category was new, a regional recognition the foundation had introduced for bakers specifically, and Noelle was not on anyone's short list. When they read her name, she was in Vancouver in the kitchen, because there was bread in the oven, and she'd sent Cyrus to the ceremony alone with instructions to take pictures. He called her from the stage. She answered with flour on her hands. She could hear the room behind him. She looked at her starter on the shelf. "Odette," she said to no one in particular, "you would have had opinions about this." The bread timer went off. She pulled on her mitts and opened the oven door, and the smell that came out was the same smell it had always been. The same smell as a kitchen in Timmins on a Saturday morning, 40 years before anyone thought to give it an award. And she stood there for a moment before she slid the loaves out, not because she needed to pause, but because some things deserve a second of stillness before you move on. There are people in every kitchen, in every industry, in every building where skill and hierarchy coexist, who look at someone and see only the job they're doing, never the person doing it. It costs those people eventually. It always does. Not because talent insists on recognition, but because talent keeps working whether or not anyone is watching, and one day the door opens and it is simply there, undeniable, on a shelf in a restaurant on the east side of a city that never knew to expect it. Dominic Leclair shuttered Le Grenier the following spring. The reasons were reported as financial. People in the industry said other things, quietly, in the way that truth moves through small communities. His name appeared less often after that. Eventually it stopped appearing. Noelle's starter turned 9 in October. She fed it in the morning before service, the same way she had every morning for 9 years, the same way Odette had shown her. Slowly, with good flour, without rushing, with her full attention on what was in her hands.